Welcome everybody to this Lunch and Learn session. My name is Diane Anderson. I am the Associate Director at EV Impact. And today our conversation is really focused around cryptocurrency and sustainability, the energy debate. So if you guys don't have your coffees or your teas or your lunches yet, please do go ahead and get them now. But as we go forward, I just want to quickly introduce the Lunch and Learn sessions that EcoBusiness holds every month. So during these Lunch and Learn sessions, we bring together experts from the industry to discuss topics that bring insights to sustainability. Before we get started, I would like to invite everyone in the audience to please go ahead and ask any questions you may have in the chat boxes, and we will come to these questions when it comes to our Q&A segment at the end of the session. Now, going into today's conversation. Today, our session is on two very hot topics, cryptocurrency and sustainability, both of which have sparked conversations, innovations, but also controversy. One of the key topic areas that have been a large issue in this in cryptocurrency sustainability is the consumption of energy on some cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin and Ethereum. Bitcoin is estimated to consume as much as the entire country of Argentina in energy comings. Alongside this, the Chinese court has recently labeled Bitcoin mining as harmful to the environment. So in today's session, we will be exploring the nuances of the topic to deconstruct the headlines and understand the actual facts. With me today, we have two experts in the field, Brianna Lee Welsh, co-founder and CEO of Renewable Institute. And we have Adrian Chung, the founder and chairman of Fintonia Group. Welcome speakers, welcome to our Lunch and Learn session today. Before we go straight into the conversation and the topic areas, I'd like to invite both of you to quickly introduce yourselves. So I'll pass it over to Brianna first to quickly do a quick introduction of yourself. Over to you, Brianna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Dion. It's great to be part of the EB community. I am the CEO and co-founder of Renewable. We are a marketplace to fund climate solutions using a native blockchain-based token called Renew. I can elaborate more on that a little bit later on.
Thank you, Brianna. Over to you, Adrian.
Great. Thanks for welcoming me to participate today. So my name is Adrian and I'm the founder of Fintonia Group. We are a MAS regulated fund manager, also regulated in Dubai by the Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority. My brother-in-law actually works for GFANZ, which is a Glasgow Financial Alliance towards net zero. So we have very interesting conversations about Bitcoin, energy usage and sustainability, and looking forward to sharing my thoughts with the audience today.
Thank you, Adrian. And once again, welcome to everyone here. Please do be reminded that do ask your questions at any point in the chat box and we will get to them in the Q&A session. So we're going to go straight into the discussion. But before we go deep into the discussion around cryptocurrencies and sustainability, I want to kind of get Brianna to maybe do a quick sharing and a quick definition on the two main consensus mechanisms in blockchain and crypto, which is proof of stake and proof of work. So Brianna, I'll just pass it over to you just to quickly define this for us.
Sure. So the answer to that question is going to depend on the audience mostly and how familiar they are with blockchain. So I understand that this audience is somewhat new to the blockchain space, so I'm going to keep it pretty high level, but if anybody has more in-depth questions afterwards, feel free to challenge me. Proof of work is the original consensus protocol or algorithm used by the Bitcoin network, which is initially used by the Bitcoin network, which is a way of validating transactions which consumes a lot of energy. Effectively, you have to solve a very mathematically intense computation, a calculation using distributed technologies and computers. And that requires just a lot of energy. It's just simply energy intensive. And so that's where you get the conversations around, Bitcoin in particular being sustainably challenging, considering that it consumes quite a lot of energy to simply exist. Ethereum is sort of the next main cryptocurrency that most people or blockchain that most people are familiar with, which is the Ether cryptocurrency. They currently also use proof of work, which is it's the same, effectively the same protocol. But as of yesterday, they've announced that they're converting to proof of stake, which is another type of mechanism, which requires people to effectively vote on the next transaction based on staking. So they contribute a certain amount of their own tokens or their own money in order to win the next transaction that comes into the blockchain. And that requires a lot less energy. It's about 99% less energy intensive compared to the proof of work protocol. So, the majority of blockchains that are being built today in 2022 or that are operating in 2022 are using proof of stake. It's really only Bitcoin and Ethereum today on proof of work. And as I mentioned, Ethereum is, within the month transitioning out of that, hopefully, that protocol. And it's a longer conversation as to why philosophically and technically speaking, Bitcoin would want to remain on proof of work. But it really comes down to the technology strength, the security of that protocol in such a true decentralized way. Effectively, the more decentralized at the moment, the more energy intensive, the more centralized, the more one company owns the protocol, the less they can rely on energy as their primary source of mechanism. And so we're going to see a lot more technologies, I believe, coming out. I'm actually working in a couple of them right now that are even innovating beyond proof of stake into all kinds of new technology mechanisms that will really resolve this problem entirely. I believe Bitcoin might be the only cryptocurrency or blockchain in the future that uses proof of work. So I guess kind of coming from that angle, I would like to maybe frame this conversation around probably Bitcoin only as a really sustainably concerning, potentially, cryptocurrency and blockchain, assuming obviously that Ethereum does transition to proof of stake when it's supposed to. So kind of framing at that, I think you have some more questions for Aidan, but we can go into the nuances along why Bitcoin's sustainability actually isn't truly a problem. And the kind of general consensus in the media is not is slightly misinformed from both a technology perspective as well as an energy, I'll say energy literacy perspective. My background's in renewable energy, so there's a lot that people I think don't understand with how energy systems work. And that I think Aidan can speak to as well. So maybe I'll hand it over to him.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brianna. I think that's a great introduction. Not much to add between the two, let's call it consensus mechanisms, but really just to step back and say, why do we care about this? Well, ultimately, having a decentralized ledger, the blockchain or Bitcoin is essentially a ledger which records transaction and ownership. And today in the world, we have ledgers or databases that are recorded by, let's call it, centralized authorities. And what happens is that there are choke points in these centralized authorities. So if you want to transfer money between Singapore and the Philippines, then maybe you're then reliant on a bank in the Philippines to be able to record the money that goes in and out. And then when you then transfer between different companies, different banks, then they both become choke points. So we talk about financial services. What Bitcoin is supposed to be is a public ledger, right, which everybody can look at, and therefore there is no kind of choke point at any one private enterprise or entity, and that could also apply to choke points with social media. Maybe Facebook has all of the certain data. So the blockchain technology being decentralized is trying to make things remove these, let's call it, choke points, right? And the question, I guess, is what systems or what processes do we need that should be public versus private? And Bitcoin is trying to address, after the financial crisis, the fact that many private and government organizations have become choke points, and therefore making it more difficult for people to access financial services. So that's really, I think, the context of why we have Bitcoin and why we have different types of blockchain technologies.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe just add to that. I think, sitting in Singapore, as many of you might be, it's a very privileged economic perspective because you have a government that you can trust. And that's very efficient and very effective at what they do. And most people are living a high quality of life. When you're looking at Turkey or Argentina, as you mentioned, or many of the countries in the world with, runaway inflation, where governments can't be relied upon to really manage the resources of the country and of the people, there's no alternative for most individuals in using fiat banking. And so it's really important to have an alternative for people in the financial system. And so that's one of the big arguments around Bitcoin in particular. And to your point about the choke points on other centralized organizations, if you think, Facebook is a great example because they, along with many of the other social media platforms, have been subject or have subjected a lot of people to things like deplatforming recently. Let's just say they changed the rules of their organization, they changed the rules of engagement, and you as a user are either required to remain opted in or you can leave. But if you leave all your friends behind, you leave your social network, you leave your followers. They own all of that. They own all the content you've produced. They own all the data. That means if you build a business via Instagram or via Twitter, your entire company is founded upon your following. You basically are economically handcuffed to that company. You're stuck in Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. So if they do something you don't like, you have no means, you have no way to there's no remediation for you. There's no power as an individual. And so the whole Web3 world, this whole decentralized ledger blockchain economy, the philosophy behind it comes from the idea that we should, as individuals, be able to make the decisions as to whether we want to subscribe to the policies of certain companies, and in accordance to their own behavior, almost holding up companies and countries to better standards of behavior, in effect, because now we can opt out and we can manage our own money, we can manage our own data. So that's kind of the overall thesis. I love the step back conversation.
No, thank you so much, Adrian and Brianna, for kind of giving us that overview of the technology and about Bitcoin and blockchain technology as well. I think just diving into the topic on sustainability related topics on blockchain and crypto. And thank you, Brianna, for kind of getting us to focus a little bit more on Bitcoin as well. Can you maybe explain the current perceived sustainability related issues prevalent in cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin? So maybe I'll just get Adrian to start us off here.
Sure. No, thanks, Dan. So look, I mean, you would have heard in the media that the Bitcoin network, running the Bitcoin network, consumes enough power to power a small country, or is bigger than a certain country. The way I would like to, I guess, what I'd like to talk about is three things. Firstly, making sure we compare apples with apples. I think the second point is making the distinction between use of energy and the source of energy. And thirdly, I want to talk about how Bitcoin can actually drive renewable energy adoption. So they're the three things I'd like to chat about, right? So, and again, we're talking about Bitcoin because it is the blockchain, the public blockchain that uses the most energy, because it is a proof of work, and it's also the largest and most adopted, right? So in terms of apples with apples, I think we talk about what is Bitcoin. It's a monetary store of value. What is the equivalent that we have today in the world? Well, there's kind of gold, right, that people use. And so you've got to think about, hey, what does the gold industry use? But actually, there's also banking. So if you just think about financial services, banking, today, if you want to store your money, which is your store of value, you have a global interconnected banking system. And because it is centralized in some form, and you have a lot of layers that need to check and confirm. So you transfer money from here to Argentina, it has to go, or here to the US, it has to go to the US banking system, the central bank. But then you also have to make sure that you have these things called correspondent banks that are making sure that they aggregate different amounts and provide these checks and balances and confirmation. Now, checks, balances, and confirmation, you can already imagine if it can be done by a computer, right? If you had one computer that saw everything, i.e. the Bitcoin network, then you can just confirm a transaction without having many people to confirm. So when you compare Bitcoin to the overall financial services system of transaction in international commerce, the Bitcoin network is 56 times more efficient. So there was when you compare apples with apples, and this is not including some new technology built on top of the Bitcoin network called the Lightning Network, which can be over 1 million times more efficient. So when you compare apples with apples, and it's quite a technical paper that's been done, you actually find that the Bitcoin network is more efficient than the current traditional rails. But I guess we don't hear that in the media. We don't hear that, hey, banking, as a whole industry uses more energy than any other, the top X number of countries, right? Because we just take for granted that, hey, this system is there. So I think comparing apples with apples is one thing. The second thing I'd like to mention is the use of energy and sources of energy. And frankly, China banning Bitcoin mining, which is essentially running large computer servers, has driven a lot of the industry to other areas, particularly in the US, where a lot more renewable energy has been used. It's difficult to get accurate data, but the North American Bitcoin Mining Council and other organizations estimate it's around 56 to 60% of all energy is actually renewable energy sources. So I think we need to distinguish between how much energy that people use versus the type of source of energy. I think the third one, which is very interesting, it's a very emerging market, is the fact that can Bitcoin mining actually drive renewable energy adoption more than it is today? So the biggest issue that we have for renewable energy, and I'm not an expert, but one of the issues I understand is a lot of projects are not commercially viable. And the reason for that is there are peaks and troughs. So in the troughs, there will be a lot of projects that just never get up because they will not be commercially viable. But Bitcoin mining is a 24/7, 365-day-a-year activity. And therefore, if a renewable energy project, which wouldn't otherwise go ahead, is able to sell that energy or use that energy to mine Bitcoin, then all of a sudden those troughs don't become troughs, and it becomes more possible for projects that wouldn't otherwise go ahead to go ahead. And that actually is something that we are seeing more and more, I guess, startups and investment into renewable Bitcoin mining, right? So, and that actually can drive increased green energy, right? Which would be great for the world. So I think they're the three things that I like to leave with people is apples with apples. Bitcoin actually is very efficient or more efficient, between 56 times to 1 million, depending on whether you look at Lightning Network. The use and source of energy is two separate things. We don't talk about the source. We don't talk about, hey, what does the gold mining industry use, or what does the banking industry use? How much of energy they use that is renewable? With Bitcoin mining, you can actually see, and of course, the economics of Bitcoin mining would always go to cheaper power, which these days is renewable. Then lastly is, can we see a drive for renewable energy adoption, which is cheaper again, through Bitcoin mining? I think they're the three things I'd like to leave with people to think about.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on a couple of those. I am a renewable energy person, so I have a lot of thoughts around Bitcoin being a better battery, actually, and to your last point specifically. But I'm just going to go kind of in sequence because I actually wrote a paper on this not too long ago, so it's a subject I've studied a little bit. I think one of the problems people have when they talk about Bitcoin consuming energy is that they don't understand the value of Bitcoin. And so the idea that you see in the media is this valueless, frivolous ecosystem that's just making some people really wealthy and the rest of the world is not participating. This is just a media narrative. Is burning up all these fossil fuels and reigniting coal plants, and it's a disaster to the environment. And the reality is that just because you don't personally have value in something or understand the value doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. If you think about it, the Christmas light industry, for example, is only really relevant for Christians, right? There's only about 1.5 billion Christians in the world. So is the rest of the world up in arms about the energy consumption of Christmas lights because a few people decide that they want to celebrate their holidays? No, you never really read about that, right? So, there's a little bit of a value skew. I think people, in order to really frame this conversation, people have to start to talk about more. The reality is that Google, YouTube, Netflix, Facebook, Amazon all use a ton of energy for their data warehouses, their data centers. And because everybody's using Google and Amazon, they accept that's just acceptable. So I think, that's one argument that we can kind of refute a little bit as you start to go into the narratives we talked about before and the true value of this ecosystem. Once you kind of unpack the layers, though, and you think about, well, what does Bitcoin consume on an energy basis relative to the other industries? As you mentioned, the financial sector, 100%. I mean, versus gold is 2.5 times less efficient energy-wise than Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is often compared as a store of value the same way that gold is. But think about other industries, the private jet industry, the cruise line industry use about the same amount of electricity as Bitcoin does. So really, if we're talking just value on a value basis, apples to apples, then we really have to be a little bit more pragmatic about that conversation. But then going down a bit further, if we start to talk about the consumption of energy and what that profile looks like, because even if you assume that Bitcoin or all of blockchain is a hugely valuable technology and economy, which I'm sure everyone on this call does, the conversation is valid that it needs to be powered by renewable energy, right? We cannot meaningfully continue to accelerate this network and allow it to be powered by fossil fuels, or it could potentially be a problem. That's a valid concern we have to consider. So what does the current profile look like right now? It is somewhere, the US is around 55 to 60% renewables. That's true. The rest of the world is not. It is mostly powered by fossil fuels. And so that's something we have to work on as a whole community. I think we do have to think a little bit, though, about the rest of the world again, right? Google and Amazon are not powered by green energy, majority. Google may be a little bit better than the rest of the world, but the majority of all other industries are actually powered by fossil fuels. In fact, Bitcoin is actually the highest percentage in industry-wise of any industry in the world powered by renewable energy. It's higher than most country, I think, at the exception of Costa Rica's grid mix. So the power that you take to your house, especially in Singapore, is almost exclusively powered by fossil fuels to this day. So why are we holding Bitcoin to a higher account than every other industry in the world, first of all? And let's move it forward as well. Let's use Bitcoin actually as the best in class and make it become the most renewable sector. I think it's totally possible. So kind of moving into the last point that you had about how Bitcoin is actually a really elegant use of electricity for quite a few reasons. So coming from just a purely energy perspective, renewable energy, while it's cheaper to buy right now, it's actually not economical in most countries to build. And that means that while it's great for us consumers buying cheaper energy, and it's really good for governments and for utilities, it's not good for the investors, and it's not good for the producers like us who want to build these solar and wind farms around the world. It doesn't make investment sense. So when you think of the world as working kind of on a financial dollars and cents, investment or incentive scheme, we're actually slowing our renewable energy deployment because there's not a lot of incentive for financiers to get behind this industry right now, because it's cheaper, actually. That's kind of the ironic twist. And so when you have intermittent renewable energy like solar and wind, which you mentioned has the peaks and troughs, what happens is the majority of the sun shines during the day when people don't consume electricity, and the wind blows at nighttime when people don't consume electricity. And the rest of the day, we need like extensive amounts of energy. And the way that the grid system works is that you have to balance loads, which means you have to balance energy production and energy consumption in order for transmission to work out effectively. And so when you have renewable energy, particularly just solar and wind, they overproduce at times when we don't need to consume. And so Bitcoin can come in and co-locate next to, because it's totally a mobile data center archetype. So it can come and co-locate next to the renewable energy projects themselves without going through a grid, which means it doesn't use transmission lines at all. It can actually literally plug in like a battery into the back of a solar farm, and it can consume that surplus of renewables produced in the times when that solar power is extra shiny. And so what it does is it actually ends up powering that power center, because now the producer can monetize that energy that would have otherwise been what they call curtailed. It literally means it's just evaporated into thin air and no one ever gets paid for it. And so it gives those solar farm and wind farm producers an extra source of revenue they wouldn't have had otherwise, and makes them more economical long term. Equally, many of the windiest parts of the world and many of the sunniest parts of the world don't exist in urban epicenters or near urban epicenters. And when you transmit energy over a long period of time, you tend to lose it. It dissipates. It's actually it's a physics problem that we don't have a solution for very well yet. So you reduce kind of the effect of transmitting energy over long periods of time. Bitcoin can actually go next to those, can again co-locate next to those power plants in the middle of nowhere, where there's no houses, there's no hospital, there's no schools. No one is going to consume that power other than Bitcoin. And so it's actually like quite a brilliant source of a, what you call a demand load and energy. And then lastly on that point is, because of the way the Bitcoin protocol works, every block is added to each subsequent or each prior block. It's basically locked in between. So you can effectively turn off its energy source in between each next block being added to the chain without any meaningful interruption to the system. It doesn't impact blockchain or Bitcoin at all, actually. I mean, it slows it down, but it doesn't disturb its technology. You cannot do that for an Amazon warehouse. Imagine Google decided to just shut down its internet because they didn't have power for a minute. Imagine that, right? Or a city block turned off their power. It's not going to happen. So Bitcoin, to my knowledge, is actually the only technology that can withstand interruptions in energy, which means that if it is plugged into a grid, it's powered by a traditional grid that powers it, like a city does, for example. And for example, what happened in Texas last year, I don't know if you guys heard about that, the freeze in Texas, they needed all kinds of heat and they had to reroute power from around the state. Now, in that circumstance, Bitcoin literally turned off their consumption. The Bitcoin miners agreed with the power producers and the retailers of electricity to not consume any power during that period. And they can do that. They can have that in their contracts. So Bitcoin miners and energy retailers or energy producers can just come to an agreement under which, in the event there's an energy demand increase for some reason, then Bitcoin turns itself off. And then it uses the additional power later on in the day or the next week or the next month or whenever it is, when the demand returns to normal or it goes into a slump. So there's a whole bunch of kind of nuances to this conversation, but the long story short is it does not steal energy from anybody. Like that's just completely false. It is absolutely incentivizing new renewable energy build out. And it's economically really quite important actually for the renewable energy sector. So as a renewable energy person, I'm quite an advocate of the Bitcoin sector, and I actually really want to see more of this this conversation happening.
Thank you so much, Brianna. Very, very interesting topics, and also very interesting examples as well. So thank you for sharing. So I guess maybe going into kind of more your industry focuses as well, and what you're both doing in your current organizations. Can you share the current state of blockchain and crypto and sustainability from your industry backgrounds? And what I think you've shared some of the myths, but what are some myths that you're seeing within your industries? And how can we kind of help debunk some of these myths as well? So maybe I'll pass this over to Adrian first. And if you could kind of give us a background from as an institutional investor that invests in cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, which is, as we've discussed, is very high energy intensive. Could you share more on your perspective on this topic? And also, what are the perceived issues and circumstances? Are they fair, or some of them just nuances? So I'll just pass it over to you first, Adrian.
Yeah, I think the challenge that I think that we have with regards to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is just education. So, we're probably like in the mid 1990s where we talked about internet, and back then a lot of the conversation was around, what is the World Wide Web? It was very technical. What is internet modem download speed, upload speed, dial-up versus broadband versus, it was very, very technical. And so and back then people were saying, well, I don't understand. There's a famous interview between David Letterman and Bill Gates saying, hey, why do you have the internet? Oh, well, you can watch a baseball game, right? And then he says, well, I can watch TV. And he says, oh, well, the difference is with the baseball game, you can, on the internet, you can save it, you can watch it anytime you want. David Letterman says, well, I have a tape recorder, right? A video recorder. Then he said, well, so we're kind of like that. It's the question of what's the use of this technology? What's so good about being decentralized and so on? And so part of the discussion for investors is, as Brianna said, what's the value of this? I don't understand this technology. And the reality is this public blockchains and this technology will be the next wave for change, right? We can't imagine it right now, just like mid-90s. In the mid-90s, people were saying, oh yeah, but you're gonna be able to watch a video on your phone, you're gonna be able to buy things on your mobile phone, and we're like, what are you dreaming about? Now it's second nature, right? Now we're talking about, hey, we're gonna live in the metaverse, we're gonna do all these things, and people go, well, it's pretty crap, look at that, I get a headache wearing that, it's all kind of weird. But the technology will catch up, and that's where we are. We're in the education phase. So we're trying to educate people, why is this technology important? What could be the uses of this? And we can't really predict how consumer behavior will change, but we know there's this trend. And then on the other side, they hear, hey, we just use a lot of energy. So as Brianna says, hey, there's on one side, I don't really understand what's the value of this. On the other side, I hear that, hey, it uses a lot of energy. So part of our challenge is to make sure there's education on the facts, and that's probably the biggest challenge. Having said that, the fact is today we have forums like this. We have investors asking questions. We read about it in the paper. We're seeing much greater adoption, and I think that's the way that we can move the industry along is education. Now, every day you open up the paper, you hear something about crypto, you hear something about NFT or Bitcoin, and then you'll read these narratives about energy usage. So for us, it's about education for the general public, really. In the internet in the 90s, many quotes came out and said the internet is only going to be used and good for nefarious activities such as drug dealing and weapon smugglers. That's what was said in the mid-90s. Now, today, we don't even talk about what is the internet, right? We don't even say internet, right? So it's the same for when we talk about blockchain. I think the day will come, we don't even talk about blockchain. It's the infrastructure behind what we'll be doing every day. But between there and now, I think we've probably got a lot of education to do.
So I think I'm just going to stick with this part, right, on how to educate the public on this. I just noticed that there is a question in the chat box, and I'll pose this question to both of you. I think it's very much connected to what Adrian was saying on how can the industry raise awareness on these potential nuances that you both have shared around Bitcoin, and to debunk some of the media narratives. And the second part of this question is, how can it collaborate with the sustainability community, government, green energy companies, to be a positive lever to greener energy? So I just wanted to ask this question because I thought it's very aligned to kind of where you were going to just now, Adrian, about education. So would love to kind of get your thoughts on these two questions too before I pass it over to Brianna.
You know, the sad or the good or sad and simple thing about the world is people are driven by money generally, right? And where we are in the cycle is you need to have high prices, and you need to have kind of speculation, which drives innovation. And because we've seen, I guess, the crypto and Bitcoin really catch public's imagination, we're now getting some of the best and brightest minds from the tech world moving into the industry in the last few years, and I think that will continue. And nothing drives people more than, you know, self-interest. So the fact is, there are now energy companies, there are now people looking at Bitcoin miners. I've come from overseas, and we now have people that are saying, well, actually, I have a lot of power, or my plant has a lot of off gas that can be converted into renewable energy. I never imagined that actually I could make money from that, so let me try and do that. And I think finding a way for sustainable, you know, ESG, there's a sustainability part, right? An economically sustainable way for people to make money, I think, is going to drive the education. So a lot of power companies, not just Bitcoin mining natives, are looking in this area, and I think that's a good thing, because if like even in Singapore, if you go anywhere in the world, right, there's a lot of power usage at 9 a.m. There's a lot of power usage at 12 p.m. Right? You build I'm not an expert, but you build the capacity for the peaks, but what happens in the troughs? Well, you don't really have battery storage. So all of these things, now people say, well, actually, I can make money on this. And that's what will drive, I guess, increased awareness and adoption. I think it's people looking to try and make money. At least from the institutional investor perspective, that's where they're looking at. How do I make money? How do I do it in a way that's not correlated to other asset classes? How much can I allocate for this, for people's pensions? That's really what, at least that's where I sit, that's what drives people.
I might have a slightly different approach to that, because my background's in behavioral economics. So I've studied incentive engineering since for more than I would like to admit. Kind of when I stumbled across Web3, broadly speaking, not specific to a cryptocurrency, but the technology opportunities around it, I got really excited, because suddenly you have an ability to create a whole new economy from scratch with each new project. And what I mean by that is you can use this technology to create incentives around tokens. So the concept of a token economy is actually not novel. It's actually a pretty old idea. It's a behavioral modification technique that uses rewards to reinforce or to shape behavior. So if you think of tokens as malleable, they're programmed reward systems. You can actually program them in a company context or in a community context to incentivize any kind of behavior you want. So Bitcoin is maybe a little bit different than Web3, because Bitcoin is, I'll say, it's like a standalone technology, really. It lives in its own world. And I think Bitcoin as a conversation around sustainability is a different conversation than Web3 and the rest of the altcoins and the rest of the blockchain conversation. And I think, Adrian, you did a really good job explaining from that lens what's important. the broader cryptocurrency conversation, though, is not really just Bitcoin. Actually, it's Web3. It's what do we do in the future? How do we rebuild the internet? How do we do so and avoid the kind of oligopolistic powers like the FANG companies that control everything we talked about before? And, how do we give people power to do the right thing and to make choices in collective commons best interests? So, I've worked in the climate sector for a while now, and the climate problem is a collective commons problem. It's a problem that is a very predictable multipolar trap, if anyone studied economics. It's in everyone's short-term best interest to act in a way that is long-term in the worst off interest for everybody, effectively. And so when our incentives, our global incentives are based around money, as you said, absolutely, based on profit, on shareholder value. We incentivize everybody to act effectively in their worst, right? Because everyone's thinking about their short-term gain. But what we can do with the token economy, with Web3, is program different kinds of incentives. So it's not necessarily about programming for return on investment financially, but return on social investment, return on cultural investment, return on environmental investment. You can actually flip the switch a little bit and talk about different kinds of capital. So in the economics world, there's a concept of 8 forms of capital. One of them is financial capital. There are 7 other. Social capital, like your social status, for example, getting your likes on Facebook, getting your, reposted, getting engagements. That's actually incredibly valuable to people. And that actually, when you look on like a biological level, that's actually it's of higher importance to us than money. Money is a form of social status, actually. And so if we can incentivize people to do good because it's in their reputational best interest, and we can actually program those rewards, let's just say for what we do in our companies, we give people a social kind of validation effectively for contributing to the green movement, to the green economy. And that is something we're betting on is going to be really important in the future, particularly when you think of kind of Gen Z, Gen Alpha. A lot of these younger generations are really genuinely concerned about the climate. They're having climate anxiety as an actual clinical pathology today. So yes, I'll say Act 1 of cryptocurrencies has been highly motivated by profit, as was most of the last 200 years of our economy. And we're seeing ourselves kind of running up against the edges of capitalism right now, because unfortunately, while it's been a good system, broadly speaking, for a lot of people, we're running up against finite resources. We have a finite planet, and we're burning out. And in order to go forward, to move forward, we have to re-incentivize people to think within the boundaries of our biosphere, our planet. And we can do that with Web3, with cryptocurrency. So what I'm really excited about is that Web3, we can actually build in a can't be evil mechanism rather than don't be evil like Google. That's a value statement. A can't be evil means it's programmatically impossible. Like we actually make it so that we design incentives around positive sum games, around eco-conscious choices. So that's a very vague answer. I can go into a lot of deeper examples, but that's where I see like a lot of optimism. And there's a movement happening in this, what I'm calling kind of Act 2 of crypto, which is around regenerative cryptonomics. And it's literally, how do we design for these kind of pluralistic incentives, conscious capitalism, shareholder or stakeholder capitalism, whatever you want to call it. But it's basically allowing individuals to make choices for the future in long-term thinking based on their short-term decisions. So how do you model for second-order consequences rather than just first-order consequences based on the original outside of the business? So it's like you get a bunch of brilliant people together and they brainstorm on how do we avoid Cambridge Analytica in Facebook, but not after Cambridge Analytica happens, before Facebook is built. Think of it like that, right? So if you're not familiar with Cambridge Analytica, it was basically the hacking, the kind of psychological warfare used by really clever people in social media around advertising. And that problem happened. It was even available. The problem was even available to happen because of the model that kind of Web2 companies were taking, which was advertising. Now, we don't have to do that in Web3. We don't need advertising. We can actually give everyone the power to monetize their own data, to own their own data, to own their privacy, and to participate and be rewarded for participation in different ways. And so that's where I get really excited about this conversation. I really think Bitcoin's a brilliant invention, but I actually think Web3 has even more potential to totally disrupt on a major scale, like our economic models, and build a better world. So that's kind of my thought around it.
No, thank you so much. I feel like we can make this a much longer panel and go even deeper into conversations around Web3 as well. But before I kind of bring the questions in from the audience, just a reminder: do drop any questions that you may have into the chat. Brianna, I just wanted to quickly touch base on what you're doing at your organization at the moment. Your firm deploys a renewable energy-backed token called Renew, which advocates for sustainability. Can you share a little bit more about this project and share some insights on it? As I think there's a few that are similar to this, but would love to kind of understand the thinking behind this token as well.
Sure. So Renewable is a green energy DAO to fund climate initiatives. So that's kind of our big picture thesis. We're beginning with the energy transition, meaning we're focusing on funding renewable energy because, partially because my co-founder and myself are quite familiar with renewables, but mostly because the energy transition is one of the easier levers we can pull to manage climate right now. I say easy because it's known, we understand it, we have the technology, and it's really not actually a complicated problem to solve. It's more about coordinating where the money goes. If we can get money delivered to renewables, we can actually do it pretty easily. There's some obviously technical things we have to navigate around the intermittency, but broadly speaking, there's actually solutions we can do. So we chose that as our kind of first climate initiative to start to fund. How we do that is we basically monitor renewable energy projects. We calculate what's called their environmental benefit. So it's sort of like the greenness associated with producing renewables, and we issue tokens representing that greenness in megawatt hours as effectively like a subsidy. It's almost like a tariff for renewable energy producers to incentivize more renewable energy. Basically, it's making, as I said earlier, renewables are not really economical for investors. They don't want to invest in the space because it doesn't make them money. So we're turning that around and we're saying we're making this a more profitable business for you. And so we'll make it more appealing to investors and to governments and to companies to build in the space. And it's not a novel, that this market is not actually novel to us. We've iterated upon an environmental instrument called a renewable energy certificate, which is similar to an offset, specific to renewables though. And we've kind of pivoted a little bit to add those positive incentives I mentioned earlier. So traditionally, this market is traded OTC. It's done very privately. A lot of kind of price gouging and simply no price transparency at all. And the producers themselves don't actually end up benefiting very often from this ecosystem. It's quite illiquid. So what we're doing is creating a global market for it. Buyers of the token are effectively they're donating funds to the projects in return for what's called a verified green NFT. So it's basically a status symbol that's recognizable. Think of it like a fair trade label or LEED certification label for the green movement. And it comes with community access to our DAO. So you can then participate in the DAO, you can vote on new climate initiatives to sponsor and to participate in. There's thought leadership events, there's IRL in real life activations that we do. And the idea is it's really like a collectible what's called soulbound, but it means it's a collectible NFT project so that people use it as their, commitment to green. It's a proof of commitment, proof of impact status symbol. So we kind of tied in legacy renewable energy markets, financial markets, into Web3 incentive engineering, and created something that we think is going to be pretty exciting for a lot of individuals and companies.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the fruitful insights in the discussions today. It's been really great to hear and understand more about the energy usage of cryptocurrencies and how cryptocurrencies are also being used to create impact in the sustainability space as well. So before we end the session today, I'm just going to take one or two questions from the chat box. I'm sorry if I don't get to everyone's questions. I would like to start with Wyman's question. Which goes, China's Bitcoin mining ban, partly driven by concerns about environmental impact, had initially sent Bitcoin mining companies into a frenzy. We're seeing in this case the regulator and the state stepping in. How does the change of the dynamics within the industries, pros and cons given now, there is a shift to the POS too? Any views on the politics behind it, especially in the Asian context? So I'll open this question up to both of you. Whoever wants to answer first, please go ahead.
I think, first of all, I think what Brianna is doing is amazing. And what Web 3.0, which is public blockchains and tokens distributed to the community to design essentially a new economy or incentive system, is what's going to change the world. In my view, just like the way the internet changed everything and software. So I think that if we take that context, which is Web3 tokens, and let's call it retail people getting access to it, then we can look at China Bitcoin mining. Governments, by their very nature, are centralized, right? So they like to have control. And again, we talk about Bitcoin and then the rest, right? So Bitcoin is like a monetary store of value, the closest thing that you will have to a store of value and pure store of value and money within the crypto world. And so I guess China, the government has a lot of other challenges, domestic challenges it's facing around its own e-renminbi and other things. So for them, and it makes sense for them, I guess, to kind of ban Bitcoin. I think it's a mistake, but that's what they wanted to do. But if you take that approach with regulators generally, and you just look here in Singapore or globally, regulators are looking at this crypto kind of volatility as saying, hey, there's been many retail people who have been ripped off here, right? So like in Singapore, the MAS has said many times, crypto is not suitable for retail. I think the challenge for governments will be, yes, there's a lot of bad actors who have perhaps been there trying to make a quick buck. But then on the other side, you have innovative, new Web3 ecosystems like what Brianna is trying to build that could actually change the world. And it's not just in Singapore, right? I mean, the internet access is global, right? And I think that's the biggest challenge that governments are facing, is how do they, protect so-called, retail investors, but not stop the fact that we have all this innovation coming out, that we don't need these centralized authorities, that we can create these token economies to drive certain behaviors. So I think that's the challenge. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure anyone has an answer because it's moving quite quickly. But I think that's the kind of dynamic we face, not only for the Chinese government, but for governments globally, is how do we deal with Web3? And part of it is they don't understand how the technology and incentive systems can actually drive major shifts in behavior. And I think that's part of all of our jobs, is to try and educate. And for example, like for Brianna, I mean, I'm on the Web3 subcommittee for the Singapore FinTech Association. We deal with regulators. We're regulated in FARA, in Dubai. We'd love to get you along to just talk to regulators, because they don't see this aspect, because maybe they see people who don't have a profile picture. They just have an NFT of an ape. And so for a regulator, it's kind of hard for them to understand or take themselves out of that and to think, okay, hey, there's some actual real value being created here.
Yeah, totally there. I mean, I've been to a lot of crypto conferences, a couple that are quite painful in terms of the presence and the energy. And I, if I were a regulator and I stepped into one of those, I can understand why they would maybe get a little bit concerned with some of the energy there. But when you step back and think, what is the ethos behind this industry? What are people really trying to do? What are they? What's the purpose and what's the potential? And I think that's where regulators are, the ones who are really progressive. I think Singapore is actually doing a really good job, I think, in the crypto space. They've been very proactive and clear in their regulations, which most certainly, I live in New York, and certainly US has not done that. If you look at Portugal or Dubai or Estonia, there's quite a few countries that are coming out with really precise, educated, informed opinions about the space. And they're going to end up, my view is those countries or regions are going to end up benefiting, because the interesting thing about Web3 is it's global and it really has no boundaries. You really don't need to live in Silicon Valley to build a Web3 company at all. In fact, Silicon Valley is a big loser in the Web3 space. And I say that because that's been the formative tech hub of Web2. And that's where kind of people identify as everything, entrepreneurial wisdom came from there. There is no epicenter of Web3. And so if people don't like their jurisdiction's decisions, they'll leave, they move. And those countries will lose that money, that talent, ultimately. We have a couple of investors in Dubai, and, Dubai has really set itself up to become a global leader in cryptocurrency. I mean, they're incredibly informed. I sat with the CEO of the equivalent of the New York Stock Exchange, in Dubai, the New York, the Dubai Stock Market Authority. I forget what they're called. I sat with him for 3 hours. I mean, I'm nobody compared to him. And I sat with him and he looked at me like, just so interested in learning and lapping up every little detail of information I had, because he wanted to just understand the potential. And to have a leader like that in an industry, in a high-ranking industry, be that humble and that curious and that open-minded, to sit there and ask questions. How can we integrate this? How can we see its potential? What do we do? What are the risks? And really question it. Those people are going to come out on top. Those countries are going to come out on top because they're going to attract the smartest people, and they're going to end up being able to figure out how to tax that money. Ultimately, if it does come down to control and to resources, they're going to benefit. And so the countries that end up trying to ban, I actually think, countries like China are going to regret those decisions later on, because, and frankly, the US as well, because, they're going to just lose their best people. No one's restricted anymore. So that might be the unfortunate reality. I think conversely, if you get enough educated, informed thought leaders doing really interesting things, really building real solutions together in a room with the regulators, with governments, and you kind of show them the possibilities rather than just the flaws. I mean, the flaws are easy to see. Everybody can, open up the Guardian and it's pretty clear, but the possibilities aren't as well profiled. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to really help inform and send tell positive stories around the potential. So yeah, I think for me, education, you're absolutely right, is like the number one biggest problem in the space right now that we have to try to solve.
Thank you so much, both. We're at time, actually. I wish I could ask more questions from the chat box, but what I'll try and do is I'll send you the questions from the chat box and send them over to our speakers and try to get them answered and maybe share them on some sort of platform in the near future as well. But thank you so much, Adrian and Brianna, for joining me today. Before we leave the session, we just want to take a quick picture, if that's okay with the both of you. So if you could just smile for the camera in 4, 3, 2, 1. Perfect. So thank you again for joining us for the session today. And thank you so much to the speakers for attending the fruitful discussion and really giving an overview of what's happening in the space, and also debunking some of the myths that we are hearing in the media platforms as well. So once again, thank you, Brianna and Adrian, for joining us. And big thank you to the audience as well for attending the session and for your fruitful questions as well. As mentioned earlier on, we do these sessions at a monthly basis. It is typically done in the first Friday of every month, and we do them on a range of different topics, from decarbonation to cryptocurrencies and sustainability as well. However, in September, we will be putting a pause to Lunch of Learn as we will be hosting one of our flagship events, which is Unlocking Capital for Sustainability, where we'll be hosting country-level events from the beginning of September to the run-up to our final event in mid-September as well. If you're interested in this event, please have a look at the chat box for the link to the event further. Once again, thank you, speakers, and thank you, audience, for joining us during your lunchtime hour. Have a good rest of your day, and have a good evening to some of you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.